everyone. This is Dr. Monique Smith Gadson with Transforming Visions Counseling and Consulting Services, where we are all about relationships, building, developing, strengthening, and restoring relationships. Thank you so much for tuning in on today. So it is Thursday, and I am going to begin a new series for I don't know how many Thursdays yet. I'm just going to say I'm going to do this on Thursdays where I focus primarily on trauma. I have been just overwhelmed with traumatic events that have taken place over the last couple of months, and that's just me personally in my individual life. And I also know that there have been events that take place that for us in society have been traumatizing, such as mass shootings. And my concern is, what do we do after we have been exposed to these traumatic events? When you think about trauma and the experiencing of trauma, you have to look at it as though it's not just the pebble that hits the brook. You also have to look at the ripple effects of that precipitating event, which is usually the traumatic event that takes place. I'm just concerned that for those who are exposed to traumas, and in this society we can be repeatedly exposed to traumas, and what do we do? What is the intervention that takes place following those traumas in order to help us to establish some sense of equilibrium as best as we can following such a traumatic event? My concern is when we don't, and when we have traumatic event after traumatic event after traumatic event, what is the long term, or what are the long term effects of that repeated trauma? And also wanting to talk about the importance of needing to have intervention as soon as possible after we have been the victim of a traumatic event, or if we've witnessed a traumatic event, or if we're hearing of traumatic events. Point is that we need some sense of intervention, something that needs to be done following this exposure to traumatic events. So today, I just want to give a very brief definition of trauma. Just really wanted to kind of introduce, this is going to be a new segment that I'm going to focus on. And part of it for me is motivated by the month of August. For me was already going to be a sensitive month. It was my dad's birthday month. He's not been here for 18 months now. He passed in March of 2018. So I kind of start the month of August with a little bit of trepidation anyway. But there also happened to be 3 traumatic events that took place in that month that had absolutely nothing to do with me anticipating my father's birthday, but all involved deaths, all involved sudden deaths, and all of them involved deaths that were tragic in nature. And I don't want to necessarily get into the details of that just right now, since it is still quite fresh, and just want to be sensitive to that. But so there was a traumatic event following traumatic event following a traumatic event. And my concern is for those people who were more directly affected than I. What happens after that exposure? What do we do? Do we seek out counseling? Do we get help? What do we do, especially in churches? Do we ever address the nature of trauma and the effects of trauma? And also, what are the consequences of unresolved traumas in our lives? So those are going to be some of the things that I want to talk about. And I'm just going to reserve Thursdays for this, just kind of until I hadn't really considered this a series, in as much as I think I want to create this space for us to talk about trauma so that we can definitely understand trauma, the nature, the effects, the long-term effects, and everything else that I can share with you about trauma. Today, I'm just going to give a very brief definition of what trauma is or what it involves, and then we will just go from there. So, when we're speaking of trauma, I'm taking this definition from Dr. Diane Langberg, who is one of the foremost experts in especially Christian counseling world, but just in the world in general, but especially she practices from a specific Christian perspective. So I really have followed her teaching and her trainings for as long as I can remember. So I'm going to give you a definition that she has written in an article about what trauma is. She says a trauma, unlike a more common misfortune, involves a threat to life, or bodily integrity. It is often a close personal encounter with violence and death. Okay? So again, that's a trauma, which is unlike a common misfortune, involves a threat to life or bodily integrity. It is often a close personal encounter with violence and death. And some of the most common feelings that are related to psychological trauma would be intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and complete destruction. And I talked a little bit about trauma back in March, I believe, after my hometown experienced a natural disaster, a pretty horrific natural disaster. Entire families were lost all at once. People were having to go and find their loved ones hanging in trees, or just found them dead under rubble. It was just horrific. So I've talked a little bit about trauma before, but that's going to be somewhat the working definition that we'll be using and we'll be discussing on Thursdays as we talk about trauma. But I just wanted people to understand what trauma is, because sometimes I think we don't recognize when we have experienced trauma or when we might have been traumatized. I have spoken to several people that I know have been affected by some of these traumas that I've mentioned that has just taken place in the last month, and some that have just been impacted by other traumas that I know of. And I'll ask, are you taking care of yourself? What are you doing? You're going to go on and get some counseling. And usually the first response is, I'm okay. I don't think I need it. I'm not that bad off. I'm not crazy, or whatever the case may be. And it has absolutely nothing to do with being crazy. I just remember when I've been involved in car accidents or when I've been rear-ended, and most people will say, well, did you go to the doctor? And I'll say, well, no, it wasn't that bad. I felt okay, a little sore, but I don't think anything major is bothering me. And people will say, you don't know what might have taken place internally. And I do remember once I was rear-ended. Well, no, I wasn't rear-ended. I was involved in a hydroplane. Yeah, my car hydroplaned, and I went and hit the guardrail, and it's definitely shaken up, definitely a traumatic experience. But I didn't go to the doctor immediately until a few days later. I developed bruises all on my forearms and kept having nosebleeds. And then I said, maybe I need to go to the doctor to be looked over. And I think that we have to think about this when it comes to trauma, that we need to just go and recognize what the effects of traumatic events in our lives can be upon us, because I think too often we minimize it, we ignore it, or we just think that it is something that over time that we will get over. And just by the definition of trauma, it's not, again, it's not just a common misfortune. It is something much more than that. And we need to be a little bit more mindful to think that this is something that we may be able to kind of get over without any assistance. So, yeah, we're going to spend Thursdays talking about trauma. I just want people healed. I want people to be whole as possible. And it has burdened me. I think this last month probably tipped me over the edge. I've always had the burden for people who have experienced trauma, but hearing people who have experienced the traumas that I have discussed, these 3 deaths by very tragic means, and there being no follow-up to going for any counseling, therapy, however that might look, has been quite alarming and quite concerning for me. And that's simply because of the fact that we live in a society where we're easily triggered. If someone walks into a store looking suspicious to us, we're having to wonder, is this person going to open up fire? Because unfortunately, that is becoming too commonplace in our society. So we're traumatized, and we're holding that stress and that anxiety within our bodies. And if we're not doing something with that, we need to understand what the long-term effects of that can look like. So I just wanted to start spending some time talking about trauma and how it is that we can resolve it. This is by no means an substitute for you going into your own personal counseling, but what I do hope it will motivate you to do is to recognize the need to go to counseling, not let this serve as your counseling. This is to be an educational piece, just to understand trauma and the effects of trauma and what it looks like in our bodies and how it manifests itself. That's what this is intended to be. So it's not intended to be counseling. So please go and make sure that you participate in some of your own personal counseling with a licensed clinician somewhere near where you live. Okay. Thank you so much for tuning in. As I've said, I look forward to spending Thursdays with you as we discuss a little bit more about trauma. If you have any questions or any information that you would like for me to focus in on, you can always email me at transformingvisions@yahoo.com. That's transformingvisions with an S, all one word, all lowercase, at yahoo.com. And I will take those questions that you have, and I will bring that information and record about that in as much as I can. Okay. All right. Thank you again for tuning in. I'm Dr. Monique Smith Gadson with Transforming Visions Counseling and Consulting Services. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I look forward to speaking with you again real soon. Have a good day. Bye-bye.